Last week, Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, addressed the Munich Security Conference, where he was asked to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. But he refused to do so.
中国不是乌克兰这场危机的当事者，但是我们并没有袖手旁观，我们也不做火上浇油的事情，我们更反对趁火打劫。中国做的，就像我刚才所说的，就是劝和促谈。我们将坚定地站在和平的一边，站在对话的一边。
And it did not help matters either that from Munich, Wang landed up in Moscow. China's top diplomat arrived in Moscow last week in what was a first visit to Russia by a Chinese official since the Kremlin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine a year ago. He met with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, and the man who is expected to succeed Vladimir Putin, Nikolai Patrushev, the all-powerful head of the Russian Security Council. He also had an interaction with Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin. Wang, who was named by Chinese leader Xi Jinping as his top foreign policy advisor last month, is making this high-profile visit as the final stop in an 8-day international tour. He had gone to France, Italy, Hungary, as well as Germany for the security conference. Wang's trip comes right after US President Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine in a show of support for the embattled country. The diplomat arrived in Moscow just days after US officials went public with concerns about how China was continuing its partnership with Russia, and that could have an impact on the war in Ukraine. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken went public with concerns that China may be rushing in to provide military supplies to Russia. Some US intel officials have also cited Chinese train movements from locations which have Chinese ordnance factories to Russian destinations. China has rebuked the US suggestion that it's going to arm Russia, and instead said that it was the United States which was arming Ukraine and thereby adding fuel to the fire. Also last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that Chinese President Xi Jinping could be visiting Moscow very soon. This would be an important signal to both the US and Europe. This would be one of the first countries that Xi Jinping will be visiting since the end of Zero COVID. He's only been to Bali for the G20 summit last year, and then of course to Saudi Arabia. This visit, if it happens, would come exactly a year after Putin visited Beijing as the chief guest of the Winter Olympics. It could further send the wrong signal to China's European trading partners. But that is not stopping major European leaders from making a beeline to China this spring. French President Emmanuel Macron and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni will be visiting Beijing in March. Earlier in January, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Beijing for a state visit. So what is at stake for both China and Europe? The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine has created a complex geopolitical situation. Countries around the world are being forced to choose sides. Now, for China, this presents a particularly delicate balancing act. It seeks to maintain positive relationships with both Russia as well as Europe. However, if China is perceived to be siding with Russia through this conflict, it could risk losing out on its European partners. One of the main reasons why China has sought to maintain positive ties with both Russia and Europe happens to be economic. Europe is a major market for Chinese goods and services, and Chinese companies in turn have invested heavily in the region. On the other hand, Russia is a major supplier of natural resources to China, particularly oil and gas. According to the latest available statistics from the European Commission, the EU's trade with China amounted to over 700 billion euros in 2022. This makes China the EU's largest trading partner in terms of goods and the second largest when services are included. Of this, China exported over 400 billion and the EU exported to China roughly over 200 billion. So the EU and China have become each other's largest trading partners when it comes to goods. But here's the catch. China also happens to be the largest importer of oil in the world. and Russia has become its top supplier. According to data from the International Energy Agency, between 2020 and 2022, China imported a record number of tons of crude oil, averaging out above 500 million tons every year. That is an over 15% increase year on year. Through the course of the last 1 year since this war began in Ukraine, Russia has replaced Saudi Arabia as the biggest oil supplier to China. In fact, trade between Russia and China crossed the $200 billion mark for the very first time in the year 2022. Now, in recent years, China's crude oil imports from Russia have increased significantly. In fact, if you go by data from China's General Administration of Customs, in 2021, China imported 84 million tons of crude oil from Russia. And in 2022, that went upwards of 100 million tons from one country alone, Russia. And this, like I said, is an over 15% increase compared to the previous year. But trade and commerce alone do not sum up China's dilemma. China recently said, and it did unveil a peace proposal for ending the Ukraine war. And from whatever was revealed in this 12-point agenda, there is nothing substantive. Certainly nothing that Ukraine or its Western partners would agree to. The problem is, China may have some leverage with Russia, but any end to this war will mean offering an off-ramp to both Putin as well as Zelensky. And that off-ramp would necessarily involve Ukraine conceding some amount of territory, particularly in the Donbass, where Russia seems to be controlling a large part of the territory. Now, this was not territory in Russian hands before the 24th of February 2022, when this war began. So what that means is that Zelensky and the Ukrainian people will be forced to swallow the bitter pill that some of the territory, which was Ukrainian before this war began, will have to be conceded as Russian if this war needs to end right now. From Joe Biden's visit to Ukraine, it is unequivocally clear that neither Ukraine nor the United States would settle for even an inch of territory loss. So China's hopes of playing peace mediator perhaps have been dashed even before it began. In past years, China has had some degree of success with Europe when it comes to concessions, particularly in regard to process. Now, that explains the eagerness with which China went on to restart a human rights dialogue between Beijing and Brussels. This dialogue, of course, was suspended during the COVID period. China had initially planned to send the governor of its Xinjiang province, its westernmost province, where minority Muslims are routinely mistreated. They wanted the governor of this province to be the speaker at this conference, but finally they aborted that plan, given what a PR disaster that could have potentially been. Europe is also demanding more concrete action from China in leaning in on Putin to stop this war. Now, the fact of the matter is that China's leverage with Russia, particularly when it comes to any kind of end to this war, may be overestimated. In any case, Putin would be loath to listen to anyone who asks him to stop a war that he started when he is convinced that he had no choice to start this war because NATO was knocking at his doorstep, and he is convinced that there is no way to end this war unless there is some kind of a buffer territory between Ukraine and Russia, so as Russia's security interests are taken care of, and that there is some distance of no man's land or buffer territory, if you will, between NATO and Russian mainland.